So, what I want to talk to you about today is climate change. Something you may have detected from the course of the semester is that international relations scholars tend not necessarily to be the most optimistic of people. Well, today we're going to have a lecture which is going to be even more pessimistic than the average of the lectures that you have had to this point, because climate change is a massive, massive international problem and one where we do not seem to have any very plausible or likely political solutions anytime in the near future. So what I am going to do today is to explain to you why climate change is such a difficult problem and why it is that the various solutions that we have on offer to us, none of them seem to be particularly effective. There are ways in which we may avoid the most horrible consequences possible, but in order to be optimistic about climate change, you really have to hope that there's going to be some extraordinary change in politics or some extraordinary new technology invented that magically gets us out of the trap that we seem to be stuck in at the moment. So I will begin by discussing the scientific consensus on climate change. This is to give you some idea of what the science tells us, of where we are at the moment, of what the plausible pathways forward are, and what kinds of policy changes they might involve. Then after that, I will go back to our old friends liberalism, constructivism, and realism to give you a sense of different approaches to understanding the problem of climate change and how these different isms each gives you a different sense of what are the plausible ways in which we think about the problem and what are the plausible ways in which we try to solve the problem for certain values of solving. And then I will talk a little bit about the international governance of climate change, how it is that climate change works, what are the agreements that we have around climate change, and I will also talk to you in passing about the politics of geoengineering, which is a new set of arguments that has emerged in the recent past about how it is that it might be possible even for individual nation states, or perhaps even for individual billionaires, to try to engineer gross problems to our gross solutions rather to the problem of climate change through changing this or that variable about the way that our planet Earth works in order to try and prevent or mitigate the problem of climate change. So, how do we begin? Well, good way to begin is the last report, which came from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the United Nations panel that is charged with gathering information, gathering data, and using this data to construct a kind of a consensus as to what is happening in climate change. And here, this is a standard feature, as you remember, of international institutions from our discussion of liberalism, is this basic idea that institutions, international institutions, are supposed to provide us with information on what complex problems are so that states can then figure out potentially how to solve them. So the IPCC this is part of this big effort that is taking place under the auspices of the United Nations to try and figure out the problem of climate change. And it involves reports by scientists. That said, one should also note that the reports by scientists, by and large, have to go through a variety of review processes before they are published, and those review processes allow for states to interfere to some greater or lesser degree in the kinds of things that are said. And given the interests that states have, the best sense that we have is that the IPCC reports tend to be highly conservative in their account of how climate change is happening. They tend to effectively to downplay the risks because states don't want to appear too alarmist. But the account that the IPCC offers is very, very straightforward in the facts that it finds. First of all, it finds that climate change has already happened. This is not a matter of future projections. This is not a matter of trying to engage in educated guesswork based on models of how the Earth's atmosphere work. We know how, over the last number of decades, climate change has already had substantial consequences. Specifically, the world is on average 1 degree Celsius warmer than it was in the period before climate change began. Now, 1 degree Celsius may not sound like a lot, but that is an average temperature. It is a temperature that in some parts of the world it is likely to be much hotter than that. In some parts of the world it is likely not to have nearly as much of an effect. And 1 degree Celsius of change around the world implies effectively that a ton of energy is getting captured within the atmosphere because of increased levels of carbon. And this is the other thing that I should make absolutely clear. The key thing that we are interested in here is how various greenhouse gases and other substances, especially carbon, escape into the atmosphere. And this is primarily as a result of human activity. And once they escape there, they tend to trap heat. And by trapping heat, by trapping energy, they make the world a warmer place than it otherwise would have been. Now, this results in what is called, so this results, if it goes on to an extreme, in what is called the greenhouse effect. If you want to understand why, for example, Venus is so much hotter as a planet than Earth, it is because of a greenhouse effect that has gone runaway and has effectively fed upon itself to produce a very, very hot planet indeed, which soaks in a lot of energy from the sun and is far less likely to give it up in relative terms than the planet Earth is. And in general, when we are talking about climate change, when we're talking about global warming, this is what we are interested in, is how these gases and these substances which are released into the atmosphere as a result of human activity, what kinds of consequences they have for the global warmth of the planet. So we already know that we have seen 1 degree Celsius of global warming, and we are extremely likely, we almost certainly are going to see an increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius by sometime in the period between 2030, just a few years down the line, and 2052. And that is a pretty high increase indeed. And it is almost impossible to imagine, barring some radical change in the world, it is almost impossible to imagine a world which does not have at least 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. So the target has been, for various international institutions and agreements, the target has been to keep global climate change to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. And if that were to happen, we would need effectively to stop carbon emissions sometime in the very near future. And even then, we would be stuck with a significantly warmer planet than we have had in the past So this graph gives you some sense of what it looks like. Here you will see that the first part of the graph from 1960 through to 2017, this shows real life measurements. So you'll see that there is a lot of up and down, and the up and down reflects natural variability in temperatures. But you will see that despite this natural up and down, if you smooth it out, there is an inexorable trend towards the world getting warmer and warmer and warmer and warmer. And you see up here, once you get past 2017, this graph is a couple of years old, you see how it is that you begin to model what the plausible things are that happen next. And this depends on how much people do to try to figure out the problem of, figure out global warming. If you have a path where you see net zero carbon emissions by 2055, there is some chance of remaining in the 1.5 degree range. If you see no net reduction, then you see a lower probability. And effectively, we are looking at a world in which we almost certainly are going to have more than 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. It's possible, in theory, that we will find some way out of it, but this relies, as I say, either some radical transformation in the world or some radical transformation in technology, which would allow us to avoid this particular fate. So if we have 2 degrees Celsius or more of global warming, what kinds of consequences does this have? First of all, it results in a global rise in sea levels. It results in the seas around the world getting higher. And this has a number of important consequences. First of all, if you have any beach property, if your family has any beach property, you may want to start thinking about that as a rapidly depreciating investment. It is likely that we are going to see, as sea levels rise, we are going to see a lot of coastal erosion happening. We're also going to see a much greater risk of inundation. We're going to see once in a century floods happening every few years, especially in cities where you have major rivers going to the sea. There are a lot of cities which base themselves around the mouths of rivers because this is a very attractive thing if you're in the Middle Ages or in the 16th or 17th or 18th century and you want to be able to take advantage of trade. It's a pretty good idea to create your city around a harbour and a river that can carry goods up from the port that you have created, but it turns out in the 21st century that this is not necessarily a wonderful plan for keeping a city going. So we are going to see, for example, Miami is going to be getting flooded more and more and more. New York City is going to be getting flooded. We are going to see San Francisco. You are going to see major coastal cities around the world are going to see regular flooding happening. They are going to become much more like Venice, and Venice is going to become much more like Atlantis. This is not a good time to invest in beachfront property, as I say, or to invest in property in the lower regions of these cities. This is not going to be a good time for them. We're likely to see more extreme weather conditions. There are likely to be more hurricanes, more winds, so more other things like that. Effectively, what you're doing with global warming is you are pumping and retaining more energy in the atmosphere, and by and large, that is going to have consequences in terms of the violence of various natural weather phenomena. We're going to see changes in rainfall patterns. We're going to see some parts of the world that expect rainfall are going to find themselves without it. We're going to see shifts which have important consequences, and we're possibly going to see the Indus Valley flooding with all sorts of negative repercussions for that region as a consequence. So here you can see a chart which shows again some pretty conservative estimates as to how this is going to work out. So you're going to see with 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, you're going to see approximately a month and a bit of heat waves during the year in many parts of the world. If you have 2 degrees Celsius, it'll be up to 1.5 months. You're going to see 10% less fresh water available in the Mediterranean, or perhaps 20%. That is a big shock to a region of the world which has many unstable countries. You're going to see heavier rainfall as a result of this. This has consequences in terms of crop damage and so on. And crop production is by and large going to be going down, except for rice, which likes hot, sticky, humid conditions. Rice production is going to plausibly go up under many scenarios. Sea level will rise 40 degrees Celsius if there's 40 centimeters if there's 1.5 degrees Celsius, and 50 centimeters if there's 2 degrees Celsius. This may not sound like a ton, but when you combine it with the increased risk of floods, this can have pretty severe consequences for coastal inhabitation. And if you want to see the Great Barrier Reef, you want to visit it ASAP. Even as I give this lecture, the Great Barrier Reef has seen the most serious whitening potential die-off situation that it has seen ever. So if you like coral reefs, you will probably not have a great amount of time to enjoy them, and your kids are probably not going to benefit from them much either. So this is pretty grim, but it also has second-order political consequences. We can imagine that if there's going to be more natural disasters, there's going to be large-scale humanitarian consequences. We're going to see floods, we're going to see droughts, and these are going to result in many people dying. natural disasters will become more frequent, and the world will be overtaxed trying to deal with the problems that it has. Hence, we are likely to see all sorts of bad stuff happening, many people dying. Places like Bangladesh. Bangladesh is already subject to very severe risks of flooding. A substantial amount of it is extremely close to sea level or below. We're going to see that the problems of places like Bangladesh becoming much worse. And this in turn can have knock-on consequences. So if you have all of these people in Bangladesh who are finding that they are effectively at risk of drowning or dying of starvation, they're going to want to move. They're going to want to transplant elsewhere, and we are likely to see massive movements of populations in a part of the world which has not historically been a particularly welcoming part of the world to people of religions which are different from the religion of the host country. And we are going to see enormous amounts of strain on the global system for trying to deal with refugees, trying to deal with people who have been displaced by natural disasters. There are going to be many more such. That system is already malfunctioning extremely badly. Things are going to be much worse. We're going to see there is going to be greater limits on resources. We are going to see much less, for example, clean, potable, drinkable water. And we're going to see also land, fertile, cultivatable land is going to become scarcer, and this in turn will lead to plausibly perhaps to food shortages and likely to increased conflict between different people, all of whom are trying to get their hands on the supplies. And all of these problems are going to intersect with each other, so that we will see floods and droughts, so people moving all over the place, leading to political instability in countries where there already may be risks of famine, which in turn will lead to greater instability. Political conflict will always result in massive disruptions of social and economic systems, again leading to greater risks of starvation and creating all of these pretty horrible feedback loops, which are going to result almost certainly in the deaths of many people. This all is the optimistic scenario. Here we see what it could be like if things go badly wrong. And this may sound pretty grim, but I've been giving you the lowball estimates as to what might happen. So here we see again, this is a graph taken from Dave Roberts at Vox, who is somebody who is very good at bringing together the data that you need in order just to understand this problem. And this graph shows you the various different pathways in greater detail that we might expect to see happening from here. First, you can look at the green pathways. These are the pathways that are almost certainly not going to be achieved, as I say, without some radical change, either in politics or in economics. Perhaps some new technologies are discovered that make it relatively far cheaper to produce to produce power, to use energy without any carbon emissions. If you look at the red shows you what is likely to happen if everybody keeps the promises that they have made, if all of the states keep the promises that they have made, which we will talk about in a little while. We would then end up in a world which would have likely somewhere between 2.6 and 3.2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is pretty bad. If states fail to take up the pledges, the promises they have made, and instead continue to behave as they are behaving at the moment, we're instead going to be in a world where the likely rise is going to be somewhere between 3.1 and 3.7 degrees Celsius. And if we see a move to a world in which people effectively abandon any hope of trying to deal with global warming, we see a world where leaders like President Trump, like Javier Bolsonaro, come to dominate so that everybody dismisses the possibility of global warming and more or less they do whatever the hell they want, we would then plausibly be in a world of 4.1 to 4.8 degrees Celsius global warming, which is a pretty terrible world to be in. Why is it so terrible? So 4.1, 4.8 sounds pretty hot, but you might think that it might be a pretty miserable time to be in various parts of Africa or in Asia, but perhaps you would there are going to be parts of the world which are going to be pretty nice. And perhaps there will be, but are also important risks which are associated with this. In particular, the risks of runaway feedback loops. Because rather as in the case of political instability, you can see political instability and starvation feeding upon each other in a kind of self reinforcing loop. You could see similar loops happening if global warming begins to have various consequences for other parts of the world's biosphere, which then make global warming worse, which then lead to knock-on effects for the biosphere again, and then lead to a kind of vicious circle. So it should be acknowledged that these are somewhat speculative. We don't have any very good models of a lot of these. We know that some of these things have occurred in the past, but we do not have any very good sense as to when exactly they are likely to become problems. But some scientists at least believe that they might kick in the 3 to 5 degrees Celsius global warming. That is, that at that level, you might not necessarily have a stable equilibrium where we get to that point and then stop. Instead, you might set off a variety of processes which lead up to a higher degree of global warming, higher temperatures, and a really miserable time for people who are still alive. Effectively, was returning back to climatic conditions which are not incompatible with life on this planet, but which have not been seen during the course of human history. They have not been seen while the human species was around. First of all, you might imagine it's very plausible that higher global warming will lead plants to die, will lead lots of plants to die. If that happens, if you see substantial levels of plant die off, then this has consequences for the carbon uptake, because plants, one of the things that they do is they suck in carbon out of the atmosphere, and hence they act as a mitigating factor which limits global warming. But if plants die because it is getting too hot for them to thrive, then we would expect to see that this particular kind of buffer begins to fade away, hence leading to a greater degree of global warming, hence leading perhaps to more plants dying, and so on in a bad situation. We also might imagine that there might be a lower take-up of carbon by the soil. Another way in which in which carbon is effectively pulled out of the atmosphere is that it can be pulled into the soil. Again, there is some reason to believe that this is less likely to happen at higher levels of temperature, and this could lead to these feedback loops. One thing that some people are quite worried about is that in various parts of Siberia, in the permafrost in Siberia and in some other parts of the world, you have massive amounts of methane which is trapped beneath the Earth. And this is because the Earth there is effectively frozen. But if it defrosts, if the permafrost fades away, then this methane could plausibly be released. Methane is a pretty significant gas that contributes to global warming, so this could lead again to a increase in heat. And finally, a lot of the disagreement between different models of global warming, and there are various different models out there, a lot of the disagreement comes from different assumptions about what consequences the global warming will have for clouds. Because clouds are an important factor that help to reflect sunlight from the Earth's atmosphere. And if we have less cloud cover, then again we can expect more energy to enter in and more energy to become trapped. And we know that there have been periods in the history of this planet a few million years ago, for example, when there were no clouds. there were zero clouds, and this seems to have been precipitated by a certain rise in temperature. Once you get to a certain level of temperature, cloud formation begins to stop, and once cloud formation begins to stop, you suddenly get a skyrocketing temperature, and as a result, you may be in for a period, again, perhaps substantially longer than human recorded history to date, without any clouds, with extreme heat as a result. Now, what all of these suggest is that once you begin to get to a certain level of energy and of heat in the atmosphere, you might find yourself in a world where the temperature does not stay fixed at a particular rate, but instead you get these feedback loops which start to go and which rise the Earth's temperature to something substantially higher than has ever been seen in human history. It has to be acknowledged, again I emphasize, that all of these effects, as opposed to the more standard global warming effects, all of these effects are somewhat speculative. Scientists think that they are plausible. They have seen evidence of this happening before in history, but they are not sure exactly of how they get kicked off, and it could well be that these effects turn out not to be as bad as we fear they might be, but it also is perhaps a gamble that you don't necessarily want to take. So if you find all of this nerve-wracking, the fundamental answer is that you want to have started taking action some while ago in order to get us to a world in which global warming is not likely to get to these heights. So here we see two pathways. And this is again a somewhat different way of depicting some of the fundamental relationships here. We see two pathways here. One is the red pathway, and that is the pathway if we have a 1.5 degrees Celsius, if we wanted to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming and keep it there. This shows you a path of all of the trajectories, so the mapping of the trajectories which are likely to get you to that point. And you will see that this requires pretty extreme action pretty well right now. So if you wanted to be on a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway, within 12 years, we would have to see a 50% reduction, a cut in half in the amount of global emissions. That's something which is extremely hard to achieve, and we would have to see global emissions going down to zero by the year 2050. If we want instead to just stick at 2 degrees Celsius and have a reasonable chance of sticking there, you probably want to see a 50% reduction in emissions by 2038, and you want to see zero level reductions having been achieved by 2065. Neither of these is impossible. These are possible with radical adjustments in our technologies, in our standard of living, and other things, but they are not easy to accomplish politically. They are very, very difficult to achieve, and they are especially difficult to achieve in a world which, again, to return to one of the standard themes of this course, a world which is politically an anarchic world. So there are different ways that you can think about this. If you think about this from the, this is a set of problems effectively, there are a variety of problems as to which dictate the difficulties which we have in reaching these pathways. Some of these problems are technological problems, and I am not equipped to do very much to tell you about the specific technological hurdles that would have to be reached. Some of them would involve the clean generation of electricity. This is one of the problems which has proved to be relatively easier to tackle than people imagined. It turns out that solar and wind, they have some problems of variability, but nonetheless they are getting cheaper faster than anybody expected. But you also want to see a massive transformation of the economy. You want to see the abandonment of gasoline for cars, move to a battery-powered or perhaps even a hydrogen-based economy of transport. You also want to see there are all sorts of complicated things. If you want to, for example, to create steel, you need incredibly high temperatures, which are difficult to achieve without standard carbon-based fuels. There are a lot of transformations that you would expect to have to expect to see if you were to get there. I'm not going to be able to tell you all that much about them. What I can tell you about are the difficulties of doing this on the world stage, of getting the necessary amount of buy-in, the necessary amount of political cooperation that would allow you to achieve this kind of world in which you could get to 1.5 degrees Celsius or even just 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. So to understand this better, it's useful to think in terms of the three isms that we've talked about already. If you think about this as being a problem of liberalism, if you think about this as a liberals, if you remember, are all about how it is that states under certain circumstances can collaborate in order to solve shared problems. And if there's any shared problem which is bigger than global warming, it's hard to imagine what it is. So liberals would see the key issue, the key problem of global warming, they would see it as a collective action problem. That the problem is that you want to get all states bought into this costly set of policies, which will have benefits for all states in turn. And the fundamental questions, and the question that liberals might ask is whether this can be solved through conventional international institutions. What kind of role could these institutions play in helping states to collaborate together with each other? Constructivists, in contrast, would point to the problems of knowledge. They would suggest that perhaps one of the key reasons why global warming is so difficult to tackle is because there is no shared, commonly agreed factual consensus on global warming, which means that it is very difficult to get to action. And this is a complicated question for constructivists and indeed for people who pay attention to these things in general, because there is an extremely high degree of scientific consensus about global warming. There is a strong degree of consensus as to what it is causing it, what are the plausible pathways forward, but nonetheless the scientific consensus has not led to a similar political consensus. There are a lot of people who basically do not believe that global warming is a problem. They dismiss it in a variety of ways, and hence this becomes potentially problematic from the point of view of solving global warming. Finally, if you think about this as a realist, you might think about this not in terms of knowledge, not in terms of collective action problem, but in terms of the survival of individual states. And you might start thinking, if you're a realist, you don't expect that states are going to be very much enthused by the prospect of collaborating or cooperating or relying upon each other. Instead, they're going to look to self-help of one sort or another, and you might then ask yourself what self-help might involve in the context of global warming. Let's talk about all of this in greater detail. Liberalism. So, as I say, the standard liberal take on this is that we live in a world of anarchy, but anarchy does not prevent states from working together in order to solve collective problems. And in particular, liberals emphasize the ways in which global international institutions can help states to solve these kinds of problems. And the role of institutions, as you may remember, is that institutions provide information to actors on what the problem is. They allow, for example, the gathering of scientific information, scientific consensus. They help to provide rules which then everybody can abide by in order to try and make sure that the problem gets solved. And they help states to monitor each other to make sure that other states are abiding by those rules and hence contributing to the solution of the problem of global warming. And in the initial era of work on global warming, there was a relatively high degree of confidence among liberals that global warming was a solvable problem, that if you got appropriate institutions, that these institutions could help states to work together to take the necessary collective action to solve it. And the idea here was that already we had seen that states had worked together in order to prevent the degradation of the world's ozone layer. The world's ozone layer protects us from harmful radiation. It prevents that radiation from reaching the Earth's surface. But it turned out that the ozone layer was vulnerable to being vulnerable to being degraded by CFC gases, these gases which effectively escaped to the upper atmosphere and bound themselves to the constituent parts of the ozone layer, with a result that the ozone layer became thinned over time, with the further result that a lot more radiation was potentially going to get through to the Earth's surface. So CFC gases were used in a variety of ways. They were used in particular for refrigeration, freon, and other such gases. But then it turns out that once states begin to talk about this, they begin to reach a reasonable set of agreements about how to phase out the production of CFC gases, and they typically stick to that. Now, it turns out that there is an example somewhere out there. We know that somewhere in China there are CFC gases being used again. They have been detected, but in general, the problem of the ozone layer is a problem that you will read about in accounts of the 1990s, but it is fundamentally a solved problem. So liberals thought, okay, global warming, this is a problem which is on a bigger scale than CFC gases. It certainly has consequences for other things than refrigeration. So we need to see a bigger transformation. Nonetheless, we know from the example of CFC gases that it is possible for states to cooperate and to collaborate on solving the problem. So what we need to do is we need to set up appropriate institutions which are collective, which provide knowledge, which provide rules, and which monitor for free riders, hence informing states about other states that are free riding and preventing this from becoming a problem that will effectively degrade the regime and make it worthless, degrade the regime and make it unworkable. And the fundamental notion here is that global warming is a collective action problem. And what is a collective action problem? A collective action problem is a problem where everyone has an interest in solving it, but each actor's contribution to solving it is going to be individually costly, and hence the most plausible equilibrium that might arise in a collective action problem is one where everybody recognizes that the problem is a real problem, but nobody does anything to do with it. One classic example of a collective action problem is overfishing. So you can imagine that if there are fish stocks of a herring or cod or whatever, each individual ship which goes out trying to fish for cod recognizes that there is a problem of overfishing and that cod is not nearly as common a species as it used to be, and that just effectively everybody's every ship by going out there and by fishing is contributing to this problem of overfishing. But each individual ship owner might think along the following lines. He or she might think, okay, there are two possible states of the world. One is the state of the world in which everybody else restrains themselves from overfishing, and I am the only actor left who overfishes, who fishes more than they should, who basically tries to catch as much as they can. And in that world, I am obviously going to be much better off because I will be able to free ride on everybody else's efforts. I will not have to pay the costs of restraining myself from overfishing. I will just reap the benefits of everybody else's selfless actions, and this is going to be awesome. Alternatively, the skipper, the ship owner or whatever might reason to themselves and say, okay, well, everybody is going to overfish. If everybody else is overfishing, therefore I have no incentive not to overfish myself, and therefore I am better off by overfishing. Now the point here is that this is a world in which this is a collective action problem in which your best response to what everybody else is doing, no matter what they're doing, no matter whether they're being virtuous and noble or whether they're being selfish or greedy, your best response is effectively to free ride or to cheat or whatever, no matter whether everybody else is not cheating or everybody else is cheating. Either way, you are better off. And so then, from the perspective of liberals, this is a general free riding problem, and we solve this, as I say, with institutions which set out the rules and allow states to detect the free riders and to stop them from behaving in this kind of way. And we can imagine how global warming could be thought about along those lines. It's very, very closely analogous to overfishing. Every state might think to itself, well, there's a real problem for all of us in global warming. Global warming presents a global challenge to every other state. But if other states refrain from taking action against global warming, then there's not much point in me taking action myself as a state against global warming. I'm not going to benefit the world's atmosphere very much, and instead I'm going to incur grave costs to my economy. But if every other state is taking action against global warming, then in that world too, I have an incentive to free ride unless somebody can stop me on their efforts, because I can pump out as much carbon into the atmosphere as I want, not have to pay any of the costs of transforming my economy, and free ride on what everybody else is doing. And so this is why liberals assume that institutions ought to do good and wonderful things, because what you need is institutions to set out the rules as to what is free riding and what is appropriate, and then to have monitoring mechanisms which can detect the free riders, tell other states, and allow other states to punish the free riders by withdrawing cooperation from them in other areas that are important to them. Constructivists, in contrast, constructivists would talk about global warming and social facts. And so their idea here would be that certainly the problems of collective action are real. They would not deny this, but they would think that there's a more fundamental problem here. The more fundamental problem is the lack of agreement about global warming, and the lack of agreement about whether it is appropriate or inappropriate to fight against global warming. So there are two different kinds of agreement that you might think about here. One is you might think about the agreement over facts. And here the question for constructivists would say that in order to have cooperation happening, you first of all need to have a common understanding of the problem at hand. You will not be able to get actors to cooperate unless they agree about what the problem is, what the problem involves, what are the appropriate ways in which you try to fight back against the problem, and all of these good things. And the standard story the constructivists have told is one of what they call epistemic communities, which is not a word that I'm going to expect you to remember, but this is a word which describes the ways in which communities spring up, in which actors have shared understandings of they have shared knowledge effectively about some particular aspect of the world. And scientific communities in particular are epistemic communities. These are communities where scientists have used the scientific method to reach some kind of agreement. And so constructivists tend to believe that once scientists have constructed this kind of epistemic community, once they have reached agreement about all of these things, then states are going to listen to them, and states are going to converge upon a common understanding of the world, because that is what the science tells them the world is. You might also want to pay attention to social norms. Many aspects of global warming might perhaps be fought better if you had norms where states believed that they ought to behave in particular ways, that it was wrong for a state to be a scofflaw when it came to global warming, that states which were fighting global warming better were by virtue of that more legitimate states. And effectively all of this is about constructing appropriate norms, rules that states can look to in order to decide what is the appropriate way to behave with respect to global warming. And so constructivist analysis then of the situation and of the problem of global warming would be to think about it as a problem of knowledge. The first key question that they might ask is, why is it that we see an epistemic community and there is universal, or near as makes no difference, universal agreement within the scientific community of serious experts on global warming that this is a real and fundamental and major problem. And so they would ask, why is it, if scientists agree on this, why it is that politicians don't follow the scientific logic, that they do not defer to the expertise of scientists. So from a constructivist perspective, this is an important problem, and it's an important problem that you want to understand if you're going to be able to understand why it is that states fail to agree on global warming. It's not simply because they have temptations to cheat, it's because many of them are led by people who do not believe that global warming is a problem. And so then you want to know, how do the facts of global warming get constructed? Who are the communities of experts who create them? Are there other actors who can disrupt these communities or can, in some sense, discredit these communities? And you want to figure out, how is it that specific actors come to believe or disbelieve in the facts of global warming as they have been laid out by scientists who are concerned with this, whether this be climatologists and modelers, whether this be people who are studying other aspects of ecosystems or whatever. There is this important query as to, why is it that some actors believe in the experts, why is it that some actors disbelieve in the experts, and how is it that this knowledge is not translating in the kind of universal manner of deference that many constructivists might expect it to work towards. You also might want to think about global warming as a problem of norms. One of the things that you might think to yourself is, if the institutions aren't working particularly well, and we'll talk about the institutions in a minute, you might wonder whether norms might work better, whether we would be better off if states and other actors believed that there were these norms around global warming which they had to abide by in order to be comfortable in their own skins as actors of a certain kind. And so then you might think about norms at the level of the state. You might think about why it is that states, for example, are or are not willing to sign onto statements or agendas or action plans with respect to global warming. You might think about this at the organizational level. You might think about which kinds of organizational groups, non-profit groups, and so on are engaging with global warming. You might want to think about the complicated role of businesses in global warming, how it is that businesses might be affected by norms as well. This is an important and a very interesting question. And finally, you might want to think about norms at the individual level. You might want to think about the extent to which individuals internalize norms about global warming that might lead them, for example, to decide to get solar power installed, might lead them to decide to buy an electric car rather than a gas guzzler, all of these things which are individual level decisions, which, if there are enough of them, might add up to a major change in global warming as a whole. Final account of the problem of global warming is realism. And realism obviously thinks about this in a different way. Realists don't care especially about collective problems. They think that every state's attitude to problems is going to be more or less that the state should look after its own interest, no matter what this means for other states. And this means, among other things, that they tend to be extremely skeptical both about institutions and about knowledge-generating processes. If you're a realist, you first of all tend to think that institutions don't do very much. They don't have very much in the way of real purpose, that what matters instead is what states do on their own recognizance. And if you're a realist, you also probably don't pay much attention to knowledge creation. You more or less assume instead that states are rational. States have a good idea, a good understanding of what are the steps that they need to take in order to protect themselves and ensure their own survival. And hence you think that knowledge generation processes really don't do all that much to explain how states behave. So what questions would you ask in contrast? You might ask whether powerful states see the problem of global warming as one that affects their security and survival. You might want to think about whether there are significant relative gains issues associated with cooperation to fight against global warming. If by cooperating with another state, I allow that other state to make greater relative gains than me, I might be worried about this, as realists such as Waltz have described. And finally, you would want to think about whether or not states can solve these problems by self-help. In other words, by undertaking their own actions. Realists tend to be very skeptical about the notion that states should rely on alliances of any sort in order to get things done. Instead, they prefer to focus on how states will, if they at all can, will just use their own resources, their own ability to get things done as a means of both achieving their goals and preventing themselves from becoming unduly dependent upon other states, which then could take advantage of this dependence. It turns out that global warming provides a kind of a treasure house of interesting questions from this perspective. So if you are a realist, you might think, well, serious global warming of the 6 degrees Celsius and up variety isn't going to help anybody, but moderate global warming might actually benefit some states at the cost of others. Very roughly speaking, if you are a state in the frozen north or in the frozen south, probably the frozen north more because the Antarctica is not a particularly hot destination for people at the moment. If you are a state which is in a chilly part of the world, you might welcome global warming for obvious reasons, because there is some chance, some considerable chance, that it will mean that the temperature of your state warms up during winter, allowing you to do a lot of things that you might not otherwise be able to do. So moderate global warming would result in a world in which states in temperate regions, so this is states in the more comfortable parts of the United States of America, states across much of Western Europe, states also which are further afield and sort of towards the colder parts of the world, all of these states would probably not do too badly from global warming, although some states, those states that have monsoons, that rely upon a regular fall of rain, that are already extremely hot, these states would not do nearly so well. So then the standard account might suggest that if you're a state, the first thing you want to ask yourself is, do I care about global warming, or do I just think that global warming is a neutral or maybe even a good thing? Second thing you might want to pay attention to is the question of self-help. If you think that you are a state and you are a relatively rich and powerful state, but you you're not in that happy situation where you will benefit from global warming, you're not in part of the world that will get any nicer, you might think to yourself, well, rather than relying on international agreements, international arrangements, international cooperation, which will require me to give resources to a lot of states I don't particularly care about, you might think to yourself, why don't I just practice my own mitigation strategies, build dikes, build walls, raise my cities, do other things like that, in order to try and soften and cushion the blow when it comes. So what we see then is that liberals, constructivists and realists have very different understandings of how it is that global warming works, and and what kinds of consequences it will have for states and for state cooperation, and we'll come back to talk about that in a little while. Before I do that, I want to give you some sense of the global warming, the regime. That is, a regime is a fancy word for a set of institutions. So I want to give you some idea of that, just as I gave you some idea about the ways in which the scientific facts of global warming have consequence. So too, we need to understand the history of efforts to reach formal agreements about global warming to understand why it is that we are in the world that we are at the moment. So this all began back with the signing of the so-called Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Agreement, which is a bit of a mouthful, but more or less what happened was that the United States and other Western countries signed a deal with the support of non-Western countries, which was aimed at beginning the process of winding down the production of greenhouse gases. This happened under the protection of the United Nations. The signing of the Kyoto Protocol, and the aim of the Kyoto Protocol was relatively unambitious. It did not aim to reduce down carbon emissions. It did not aim to target a large number of states. Instead, it targeted just 37 industrialized countries as states which were supposed to reduce the emissions of greenhouse gases, and it did so through a combination of vouchers or permits or whatever, which more or less sort of allowed you as a business, were allowed to get a permit from the government to have a certain amount of greenhouse gas emission, but then you could sell that permit on the open market to another company which perhaps needed it worse, and then the idea was that this would then result in an efficient allocation of these opportunities to pump out greenhouse gases, so that it would really, so that the permission to go to this would go to the businesses that would find it most costly to comply, hence limiting the economic fallout from it. And in addition, there was a so-called cap and trade arrangement, which was supposed to see once you had reached a stable emissions of greenhouse gases, was again supposed to allow for the trading of quotas to produce greenhouse gases in order to provide a generally in order to provide a generally economically efficient outcome. Now, the Kyoto Protocol, the United States was involved in negotiating and it signed the protocol, but it did not subject itself to the rules of the agreement. Or the rules of the agreement primarily applied to 37 industrialized countries who had to pay the costs of global warming, of mitigating and at least of stabilizing the production of greenhouse gases. And non-industrialized countries, countries which were still economically developing, they got the benefits of Kyoto but not the problems. So they could receive benefits from trading or offsets. In other words, say for example, you were a country which had lots and lots of forests. You could then use those forests to say, well, we're using those forests as carbon sinks. I will promise not to cut down these woods until and unless a solution of global warming is reached. And if you did that, then you effectively would have an offset. You would have a negative balance for those woods of the amount of carbon which the woods absorbed, and then you could sell this on the open market to some business elsewhere in the world which desperately needed that offset in order to allow it to produce more greenhouse gases. So this complicated system was set up, this regime was set up, which was supposed to provide not a complete solution to global warming, but at least some degree of a start to addressing the problem, with the expectation that it would be possible for states to move on from those baby steps at a later point. However, there were obvious problems. First problem was obviously that the regime was grossly insufficient to solve the problem. As I say, it effectively imposed caps on a number of industrialized countries, but did nothing else besides. So plausibly, Kyoto was not completely useless. It plausibly helped to stop the acceleration. If you want to think about it in coronavirus terms, it helped countries to bend the curve more than they would have otherwise. And it also helped countries to start thinking about the plausible arguments for doing something about global warming, about why it is that global warming was a major threat, and to begin to prepare in their heads some kind of expertise about the policies that would be necessary to stop global warming in its tracks. But in addition to being grossly insufficient to solve the problem among the industrialized countries, as I say, it did not impose any real obligations on less developed countries. Instead, they benefited from the regime but did not have to pay the costs, and this became increasingly controversial over time. The United States, for a long period of time, claimed that the reason it was not getting involved in various international agreements on global warming, one of the reasons was because China was China was able to take advantage. And this was probably a pretty self-serving and transparent excuse. But nonetheless, the fact that China and other countries could engage in global warming and the emission of greenhouse gases became more and more of a problem over time. And if you want to understand why it was a problem, here is a graph that will explain to you. So what we see in this graph is we see increases in the gigatons of carbon dioxide which are emitted every year. And we see here a pretty interesting standard account looking at how it is that different countries responded to the incentives within that system. So we see here that the United States is the blue line, and it carries along at a pretty steady state of global CO2 emissions for a substantial period of time. And it and Europe are pretty closely aligned. They are similarly sized economies, but then the United States begins to increase its greenhouse gas emissions substantially, and it never goes back, whereas Europe remains steady and eventually starts to gradually trend downwards. The United States starts to trend downwards too in the early 2010s, but it is not nearly reaching the European level by the time that these figures run out. So you can see here, this in a sense tells you a lot about the two key states in the trading bloc that effectively and sort of went on somewhat different trajectories when it came to global warming. But of course, this isn't the real story here. The real story is China. So China, you see here, it engages in a gradual increase in its emissions of greenhouse gases, as you might expect, as it becomes a more modern economy. More greenhouse gases get produced on a steady level. But then around 2006, 2007, 2008, something happens. There's a brief interregnum, and then all at once, we see a resumption of growth in carbon dioxide emissions, but at a much, much steeper rate than had ever been contemplated before, so that China and all other countries, especially together with India, by the time of 2017 or so, they vastly outstrip the traditional major industrial states at the center, and indeed China is effectively putting out as much greenhouse gases and more as the European Union and the United States together, so that we now live in a world in which it is not possible for the rich countries to band together anymore in order to decide what to do about global warming. Instead, we live in a world where it is necessary to figure out a solution that incorporates China as well. Unfortunately, we're not there. Instead, we have negotiated a variety of agreements in the meantime, two agreements which are particularly important here. One was the 2009 Copenhagen meeting, which was an illustration of how things could sometimes go not particularly well. This was a meeting which was, of course, in the middle of the global financial crisis, but relatively soon after President Obama had come to office. And the idea behind the Copenhagen meeting was that this was going to be a major step forward, where effectively, rather than having Kyoto, which was of course riddled with loopholes and was a relatively weak set of rules, we would have a much more comprehensive set of rules, a much more comprehensive framework, which would allow states really to begin to address global warming, and also would incorporate some responsibilities for less developed countries. China and other countries would not simply be free riding on the United States, they would instead be expected to contribute to solving the problem. Kyoto didn't work. It failed in this objective. It failed to reach a successfully negotiated text. Instead, what happened was that a so-called political accord was negotiated, which did not have any binding force. So Kyoto was it fizzled. It did not work nearly as well as it should have. And when Kyoto was very clearly in trouble, then we saw a lot of other people begin to get nervous that the global regime for dealing with global warming, these international agreements, were simply not working anymore, and we needed some alternative to international multilateral agreements. So this period we see a number of people beginning to push for different ways of doing things. First of all, they start to push for different initiatives at the national and subnational level. They say that it isn't simply sufficient to rely on international agreements. States have to comply, and more than comply, with global warming rules by creating their own subnational and national initiatives. And secondly, there was a lot of worry about the coal-fueled economic expansion in the developing world. If you want to understand why growth in China's emissions skyrocketed, the answer is that from 2006, 2007 on, China was building coal-fueled power plants left, right, and center because they were cheap, because it wanted to maintain and accelerate its economic growth, and building coal-based power plants was the best way to do this. But of course, this coal-fueled economic expansion, while it had economic benefits for China and political benefits for China, it also meant that global warming became a problem at a bigger scale and more quickly than anybody expected. Copenhagen was not the end of the process. The most recent version of international agreements in this regime against global warming is the so-called Paris Agreement. The idea behind Paris was to set out an objective which was to aim for 1.5 degrees Celsius, and if possible, that was the aspiration, and if possible to try and keep the temperature rise beneath the beneath 2 degrees Celsius. So in order to do this, states were required to make their, quote, best efforts through, quote, nationally determined contributions. Now, this is a slightly odd phrase, and more or less what it said was that rather than trying to opt for the model of Kyoto, or the model that they had tried to achieve and had failed to achieve in Copenhagen, where they tried to create rules that everybody would adhere to, instead they tried to create a system which was based more on norms. In a sense, on telling states that this is the thing that you're supposed to do, that it is appropriate to make best efforts through your national contributions, and hoping that these norms would be sufficient to provide states with a reason to start fighting against global warming. So we've seen that this has worked to some limited degree. Some European states took the Paris Agreement and then used it as a foundation for laying out some very ambitious goals, which were to start from the bottom and to transform their energy economy, to move away from coal, to start to close down coal processing power plants, moving towards mandatory electric cars, and having a whole lot of other different standards, different regulatory changes which were supposed to make it possible and easy to keep the global level of global warming at a reasonable level. But it turned out that this stuff, all of these efforts, while sincere and having some consequences, they only partially helped to move towards the targets. And once Trump was elected, he withdrew effectively from the Paris Agreement, albeit he withdrew in a way which was not particularly meaningful or effective. So we now live in a world where the Paris Agreement is there. It has inspired some states to go on to major new efforts, but other states are declining to get engaged. And the last few weeks have seen a final twist to this. We now see that oil is far, far cheaper than it has been in a long, long time in the past, and this has complicating consequences. It means, among other things, that if you think about this in the short term, and the reason why we have cheap oil is because of fights between Saudi Arabia and Russia, and also a massive fall in demand thanks to the coronavirus. If we think about this in the short term, this might be something that might be a deterrent for companies or for power plants that want to invest in renewables, because they might look and say, okay, well, oil could be at the level of $13 or $20 a barrel for a decade. Why the hell don't I just use oil because it's so much cheaper? So this is one possible short-term way in which you could imagine that cheaper oil might lead to less spending on other renewable forms of energy. That said, if you want to be a little bit more optimistic, you might say, well, this is true, but in the medium term, this might be that we're going to see less oil produced because, first of all, places like the shale oil sands in, and tar oil in Canada, that these kinds of places where it is expensive to produce oil, they're going to go out of business pretty quickly. And we might also expect that over the longer term, if oil is going to be that cheap, that we are going to be in a world in which it doesn't make much sense for investors to spend a lot of money investing on oil, in particular because this is a commodity which may lose its value over time, which as we move to a different kind of energy economy. And so if you wanted to be optimistic, you could say that cheap oil today means that is going to mean that medium-term planners are going to decide to divest themselves from the oil sector because they're not going to make much of a profit from from investing in oil. So, how do we think about this then from the perspective of the different approaches that we've talked about? If we think about this from the point of view of the liberal understanding, you'll see that the original efforts in Kyoto were what you might have thought about as being the creation of a liberal trajectory of ever increasing and ever more powerful and ever more useful institutions to help states solve their collective action problem. And then you'll be faced with an important set of challenges because it is not developed in the way that liberals might have expected it to develop. Copenhagen, as I say, was a failure, which was saved only by a pretense among the states. They came up with this political statement, which was non-binding. Paris was more successful, but Paris does not have binding rules. Instead, it has options and it has recommendations effectively, and those might have benefits, but liberals are probably going to be pretty skeptical about this. So liberals would look at this and say that this is a regime, this is a set of institutions which is not capable of really solving the problem in a comprehensive way, and that this suggests the liberal account in which states are going to have a strong incentive to solve collective problems through through collective action mechanisms and institutions, that this understanding doesn't seem to really be working out in global warming as they expected. There is a huge problem, it is an enormous problem, it is an existential problem, but it is not a problem that states are prepared to solve. And furthermore, not only are they not prepared to solve, but whatever institutions they have come up with that are soft and weak and not particularly effective from a liberal perspective, even these institutions may become less effective in the future as states such as the United States begin to break away from them, making it more likely that we're going to see global warming at 2.5, 3.2, 3.5, or maybe even 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. So liberals have sought to respond to this disappointment by developing what, and this is not a reading that I've assigned, what Bob Keohane and David Victor call a regime complex, and the idea is that even if you can't get a proper institution, if you create a number of intersecting arrangements, this may help to solve the problem to some degree. And what you want are smaller, non-binding initiatives, which are aimed at encouraging cooperation between different actors to do things such as developing new technologies. And liberals have suggested that this regime complex may be working better than the skeptics might have imagined. It's hard to evaluate what specific consequences the creation of a variety of different interlocking institutions, tiny institutions, has had. But what one can say is that the technologies are developing and developing faster and more effectively than anybody expected. This is especially true on the power generation side. Wind and solar are becoming much, much cheaper to the point that it is not a sensible idea to invest in creating a coal-based power plant these days, unless you have some strong political reason. That wind and solar are cheaper. The problem that they have is that they are variable. The wind sometimes doesn't blow. Sunshine obviously only happens during the day. So one of the key pushes at the moment is to try and create, on the one hand, more efficient transmission networks so that you could transmit power, for example, from places that have a perpetual oversupply of wind, such as Kansas, to parts of the country and indeed parts of the world where they do not. And secondly, there is a lot of incentive to try and figure out better storage solutions for electricity, which might involve better battery technologies, might involve more complicated systems involving salt water and other things which can store energy under certain circumstances. All of these new technologies that people are looking to develop in order to reduce the variability of these things. And then also you have electric cars. There is a big, big push happening. Various companies, we will see how coronavirus does or does not affect this, but various companies in the automobile sector are moving from gasoline-based cars to electric cars and they're seeing this as the way forward and effectively betting their shop on the idea that these cars are going to get cheaper and going to get more attractive to consumers over time. So here liberals would effectively say, well, they don't have a complete solution. We have not seen the kind of collective action solving global institutions that they would like, but it might be possible to do less ambitious things, less ambitious regime complexes, which would help to develop new technologies such as wind and solar and help to get the word out and encourage collaboration and do all of these good things. Constructivists are faced with this problem, which is that many people, including the current President of the United States of America, don't accept the science behind global warming. They don't think that global warming is necessarily a real thing. And if there is this level of disagreement, this then has consequences for politics. It means that global warming is not generally accepted as being a social fact in the United States. It is not part of the consensus. It is becoming more of a consensus than it has been in the past. More people believe that global warming, man-made global warming, is real than did 5 or 10 years ago. But we see large portions of the media, large parts of the political class, which are frankly skeptical about the existence of global warming, or who view global warming potentially as being a good thing, or who otherwise don't accept it as being a problem that needs to be solved. And when you have a substantial opinion which is opposed to taking global warming seriously, this then means that it's really hard to get successful action against global warming, because in the United States, for example, if you want to have an international treaty, you need 2/3 of the Senate to sign up to that treaty. And so this means that all you need to block it is 34 senators. And I think that we are a long way away from the world in which the number of senators who would oppose major transactions or major agreements on global warming would be anywhere near as low as 34. More plausibly, it is somewhere in the high 40s through to the low 50s, depending on how many Democrats as well as Republicans think that global warming is less of an issue, and whether or not a couple of Republicans, such as perhaps Senator Romney of Utah, might be persuaded to vote for a global warming agreement. And this is not only a US problem. We have seen the spread of global warming denialism to Brazil, where the president there, Bolsonaro, is vehemently committed to the notion that global warming is a kind of a vicious plot against the Brazilian people, and is looking to encourage as much of the Brazilian jungle as possible to be cut down in favor of ranchers, which also obviously has consequences for global warming because of the role that plants play as a carbon sink that we discussed at an earlier point. So constructivists don't have much in the way of solutions. The standard constructivist thing might be to say, well, let's create agreement, let's make social warming or global warming into a social fact. But the record of constructivist research would suggest that it's really, really hard to achieve consensus on these kinds of things and to get people to accept things as social facts. That most efforts to entrepreneurially to change people's understanding of the world, most of these efforts fail. Nonetheless, constructivists would say if you wanted to maximize your chances, there are a number of things you might want to do in order to frame the issue of global warming for people who are unpersuaded. First thing you might want to do is, rather than presenting them with abstract-sounding facts and relying on experts looking down their noses, perhaps at ordinary people, you ought to link the issues of global warming. You ought to link them to domestically relevant concerns. You ought to explain in a plain, straightforward, and practical fashion what the consequences of global warming are for people's lives. You want to use direct lived experience in order to get the point across, and that this can have consequences over time. It is unlikely to convince those who are profoundly convinced that global warming is not a problem, but it may help to sway people who are somewhat on the fence over it. And as I say, there has been a significant increase in belief in global warming among US citizens over the last decade or so. Realists, in contrast, would say, forget about trying to encourage international cooperation, forget about trying to create general agreement. Let's just focus on states looking after their security interests, and let's just think about global warming as being another potential threat to the interests of the state. And here, realists would suggest that there is going to be, if you want to think about global warming, you don't want to think about it from the perspective of what are the prospects of some kind of global agreement. Instead, you want to think about the interests and the capabilities of states. That is, what states want and what states are able to do about their desires. And here there are a number of important facts that realists would point to. One is that countries such as the United States are likely to get hit by global warming, but nowhere near as badly as other countries. And this means that countries like the United States may be less inclined to do something about global warming. Furthermore, some countries, and again, these are powerful countries, have the possibility of taking or blocking international action. If you want to have an agreement on global warming that works, you now have to have China. It is impossible to imagine an agreement on global warming that would work if China was not a member of it. You probably want to have the United States as well. And this then means that states like China and the United States have some very, very important veto power. They are able to shape whether or not any form of coordination evolves, and they probably are going to shape it in ways that are not going to lead to cooperation. So China is actually it's moderately more affected, plausibly, than the United States. There are large parts of China, inland parts of China that might be quite badly affected by global warming. So China has been more responsible in some ways than you might have expected, but also at the same time, China, as I say, has constructed all of these power plants which are based on coal and which are belching carbon out into the atmosphere at a prodigious rate. So China and other powerful states, you might expect, they're going to look to the world and they're going to be unlikely to want to bind themselves to collective commitments which might not be in their interest. And furthermore, they're going to vary dramatically in how much they care about global warming. Some states are not going to care particularly. Some states may actually do better in a world of global warming because they may see parts of their territory being unlocked. Russia, for example, might do better in a world where Siberia became a plausibly somewhat pleasant place to live in, rather than a place where you notoriously send exiles to. So you can imagine that Russia might actually want to prevent action actively to prevent action against global warming because perhaps Russia is going to benefit from it over the longer term. And so then you have differences in states' desire to do stuff about global warming and differences in states' ability to do stuff about global warming. And the almost inevitable result of this from a realist perspective is going to be some degree of gridlock. So the realist solution to this might involve a greater degree of reliance on self-help. That is, that if you are a state who doesn't care about global warming, who is going to be benefited perhaps by global warming, you're not going to do anything about it. If you're a state that does care about global warming because you feel that your security is going to be undermined by it, perhaps directly because lots of your low-lying cities are going to be drowned, perhaps indirectly because it might increase insecurity and instability in your local region, then you are going to look to your own resources to try to protect your own interests as best as possible. You're not going to look to institutions. Institutions you're just going to regard as being, these non-binding commitments which don't really change state interests. Instead, you're going to rely upon your own ability to look after your own interests. So what are the things that you might expect states to do? You might expect them to invest in mitigation technologies. That is, technologies which will lower the negative impact of global warming. Very obviously, these might involve in places, so you've already seen in Holland, for example, over centuries, they have developed dikes to protect their polders from being flooded by the sea. You might expect to see the development of dikes. You might expect to see the development of systems to manage harbors and prevent harbors from being flooded. You might see similar things happening with rivers or with fresh water. You might see efforts to gather fresh water in reservoirs. All of these things which are intended to mitigate the impact of global warming for your citizens without necessarily paying much attention to the citizens of other states. And you might also imagine that states would plausibly engage in unilateralist geoengineering, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. It's in greater detail. It's effectively efforts to try and push back against global warming by re-engineering aspects of the world, the world's atmosphere or other parts of the world's environmental system in order to prevent global warming from becoming too bad. And a state might plausibly look at global warming and decide that the benefits of acting on its own against global warming outweigh the costs and engage in unilateral geoengineering, regardless or not of what other states are doing. Now, if you want to be optimistic about this, you could say that even in this realist world, states could benefit from what other states did. Because in contrast, say, for example, to security dilemma type situations in which one state's efforts to try and increase its own security is going to damage the security of other states, you would imagine that many, and perhaps even most of these mitigation technologies If one state undertakes them, they're not going to have any negative consequences for other states, and perhaps other states can even benefit from them if, for example, they are able to use technologies that are developed in other states to mitigate global warming and to buy these technologies to use in their own situations. So there is some possibility for positive cross-national spillovers, more or less by accident. So this is not an intention that realist states would have when they're pushing back against global warming, but it could nonetheless emerge. And to talk in a little bit more detail about geoengineering. What is geoengineering exactly? So geoengineering is a fundamental notion which suggests that it might be possible to turn back global warming through technical means. And the intuition is pretty straightforward. That if it is human activity which is making the world a less pleasant place to live in because global warming is happening, you can imagine that human activity, if directed intelligently, could turn back the clock on global warming and prevent it from becoming a major problem. Various ways in which you might do this. One might be to increase reflectivity through stratospheric aerosols. That's more or less through sort of having floating moisture in the upper atmosphere, which would then reflect back more of the sunlight and help keep the world cooler. You could also do this similarly through injecting salt water into the upper atmosphere. It would have more or less the same kind of consequence. Another possibility is to release iron into the ocean to fuel algae. And the idea here is as follows. Algae would then, they would capture carbon as they grew like scum on the top of the ocean. They would capture lots and lots of carbon, and then they would die and they would sink to the bottom of the ocean. And if this is a sufficiently deep part of the bottom of the ocean, they could be there for millions of years, at which stage the problem presumably would be irrelevant. Another possibility is to use various techniques to try and increase the reflectivity of the surface of the ocean. And if you increase the reflectivity of the surface of the ocean, you are going to be able to bounce back more solar energy out of the atmosphere, and hence you're going to have less warming happening. Now, these are some of the possible techniques of geoengineering. There are other techniques as well. All of these could possibly serve to limit or even to push back global warming, and especially if they were used together with other technologies such as carbon capture, which is, these are techniques using human ingenuity to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and to capture it in places where it will not re-enter the atmosphere. And also I turn to biofuel, which is effectively a means of, maintaining carbon neutral forms of fuel. So all of these forms of geoengineering could possibly have impact, and some people claim big impact on the problem of global warming. Now, the interesting thing from the perspective of international relations theory is that geoengineering does not necessarily require any collective action. It doesn't require states all to agree. It could be that an individual state or even an individual crazy billionaire decided to carry out geoengineering and to see if it worked. Now, of course, there are some problems associated with it. Geoengineering could have global benefits, but it might also have negative and unpredictable consequences for some states. If we see, for example, the world cooling down again, this could lead to, to some parts of the world getting colder than they ought to be. We might imagine trying to fine-tune these technologies might be very difficult. You might see overshoot of one sort or another. All sorts of unpleasant and unwelcome side effects are likely with many of these things, because really what you're trying to do here is you're trying to mess with this incredibly complex system, which is the global, the ecosystem of the world, and you're hoping that you will be able to fix it. But there are going to be all sorts of unexpected repercussions of any major action that you take. So this then helps explain why geoengineering has not gotten as much discussion as you might expect, because it is uncomfortable for both liberals and constructivists. Liberals might fear that if people begin to think about geoengineering as a plausible solution for global warming, that you might see a move away towards efforts to build a consensus. Instead, you might see states pursuing their own individual plans, which might not necessarily work. Constructivists would worry that if you reconstruct a problem from a collective problem to something where individuals can take action, that your ability to construct the kind of shared knowledge and shared norms that you want in order to fight global warming is going to be limited, and hence you are putting all of your eggs into one basket, and into a basket that could well crack and break open with all sorts of unpleasant consequences. Realists, in contrast, insofar as they've paid attention to these questions, tend to be more in favour, because they believe that this is the kind of option that you could see being pursued by individual states, which of course is something that realists see as being the most plausible and most likely way in which states protect their interests in the world is through relying upon self-help, to the greatest extent possible, sometimes relying on allies as well, but certainly realists tend to be much more skeptical about this notion of big multilateral efforts to try and solve collective problems, and much more willing to believe that problems are likely to be solved if they can be solved by individual states or perhaps by very small groups of states. So geoengineering is an interesting and important set of questions. What I want to leave you then with is a number of broader questions, which is what you have seen in this lecture is that it's hard to be optimistic about global warming. It may be that there are some technological approaches, that there might be some magical geoengineering wand that we can wave, which will make the problem go away, but the chances are unlikely that this is true. Equally, the chances are unlikely that we're going to see any really sufficiently strong consensus on global warming to how to tackle it, that we're going to see the real kind of concerted global action that you would want to see to move the world onto a different pathway of the sort that might, for example, result in a completely zero carbon emissions economy by 2050. So if you wanted to be very slightly more optimistic, you could think about a mix of different possibilities out there. One is you might think about the most optimistic way forward. And this is to try and think about how it is that new technologies, it could be that new technologies are developed that solve the problem of global warming with only a minimal need for international coordination. If it becomes cheaper to use carbon neutral technologies or carbon negative technologies even than the technologies that we have at the moment, if it becomes cheaper to move to a trajectory which is carbon neutral, so that markets can do this all on their own without the need for political agreement, then we are in a win-win situation. We're in a situation where it doesn't matter whether states agree, it doesn't matter whether you are unable to get 2/3 of the Senate to ratify a treaty, you don't need agreement. Instead, you can rely upon market processes to do your work for you, to effectively move to this new trajectory without any need for major political action on your part. Another possible world would be a mixed world. And this is a world where we are likely to see no general coordination, but instead where states employ a variety of different self-help approaches. This is the realist account, mitigation, or perhaps some sort of geoengineering of some sort or another. And this may result in some benefits. It probably is unlikely to solve the problem as a whole in a satisfactory fashion, but where you might see some spillover of benefits and of technologies moving from one country to another. And it might well be also that without seeing a genuine huge consensus among the world, some states might be able to manage to figure out semi-coordinated solutions of the sort that we have seen in the European Union, for example. And this could, even if it can't solve the problem, it could help to make the problem look better around the edges. Again, of course, who knows what's going to happen? We're in a new world thanks to the coronavirus pandemic, where the degree of political cooperation between countries that one would want to see to solve global warming is suddenly looking a lot more difficult than people expected it to be. And this then leads on to the negative approach, which is reflected in the Colgan, Green, and Hale reading, where they talk about what they call existential politics. And existential politics is, in a sense, a world of struggle, which is not just a world of struggle among states, but a world of struggle all the way down, where the existential dilemma that realists think about, which is really the question of survival. That this question of survival doesn't just operate at the level of states, doesn't just drive states, but it also drives groups within states who worry that their way of life is fundamentally at risk, whether this be people in coastal cities who suddenly realize that their property, their lives, their houses are liable to be destroyed, whether this is people in the petroleum sector who think that their entire way of life, their entire local economy is going to be demolished. All of these people with these interests which suddenly may come to clash with each other in a much starker fashion as a result of global warming than we have seen at any point in the recent past. If we end up in this world of existential politics, it could be that this could see some kind of long-term solution in which the people who are on the carbon neutral side of this, the people in the flooding cities, the people who believe that their future is being compromised by the lack of any political consensus, that these people win. But the best case scenario here is a long, brutal, and perhaps even violent struggle, because we could see, for example, that sort of among the interests who are going to be potentially disadvantaged in this world are states which rely upon petrochemicals. They rely upon petroleum exports in order to keep their economies going. And so that then the question is, what happens when countries such as Saudi Arabia, if they see their riches disappearing? What happens in countries such as Nigeria, which rely extensively upon on the production of petroleum in order to keep their economies going? Can these countries hold together? Will they collapse? You could see a slide into a lot of political anarchy as a result of a transition if we get into this world of existential politics that Colgan, Green, and Hale describe.